I don't know a whole lot about PHP. In fact, I haven't touched it in about 10 years or so. It's been a while, but I'm going to go ahead and start off this channel with a series on PHP fundamentals for a couple of reasons. And one of them is because I just came from the DrupalCon conference out in Los Angeles. Drupal is a content management system. It's powered by PHP. I spent a terrific few days there learning more about the content management system. Of course, you need to be a PHP developer if you're going to develop on a PHP-backed platform like Drupal. So obviously, I have a sudden interest in getting to know PHP better. But second, part of learning programming is stepping outside of your comfort zone and diving into languages or APIs or platforms that you really just don't know. And because I've done this in the past, I've been able to learn how to write mobile apps or video games or even other new programming languages that I really didn't know before. So that being said, you'll see me stumble here and there, and I'll try not to edit out my mistakes unless they completely confuse the situation, so we can keep it as real as possible. And hopefully my goal here is not to make bad videos or make myself look like an ass, although I'll probably do that here and there. No, the whole idea is to let you know that you may encounter some of these trip-ups yourself, and it's good to see somebody else kind of doing that as well, just so you know it's kind of part of the process. Anyway, let's go ahead and begin. All right, what you're looking at right here is my PHP IDE of choice. This is technically IntelliJ. It's a very popular Java editor, but it's got plugins to support PHP development. It is effectively an IDE called PHP Storm, which I've got here up on my browser. This is an IDE I've been using for about a year now for Java development, and it's pretty popular for PHP, and it was one that I saw used repeatedly in a lot of the sessions that I was looking at DrupalCon. Something like an IDE is IDE, by the way, stands for Integrated Development Environment. So it's going to do a few things for you. It's going to give you some code insight, let you know, give you some clues or some hints when you're doing something wrong, or kind of help you complete some PHP functions, understand the argument collections and things like that. A really feature-rich IDE is going to include some additional tools for connecting to databases and things like that. So it kind of gives you everything that you need to develop a complete application all in a single user interface here. It's not absolutely necessary that you use an IDE. You can use text editors. I know TextMate is a popular one on Mac. So at a minimum, you need something that you can use to write PHP code. And I'm going to use this IDE. Like I said, it's called IntelliJ or PHP Storm. You can get this if you wanted to by going to jetbrains.com/PHP Storm. But you can use anything. It can be a text editor. It can be something. It could be another editor like Eclipse has support for PHP. It could be anything. So at a minimum, you need to have something that you can write PHP in. So an IDE or a text editor, and of course you need to have PHP installed on your system. If you're developing locally, you'll want to have PHP installed. And because it is a web-based application platform, you need to have a web server installed to see the work that you're producing. That's going to go kind of beyond the scope of what I'm going to talk to you about here. There's a number of things to cover as far as installing a web application server with PHP. I can tell you this. If you're on, if you're on Mac, I think you'll find things like MAMP Pro. So go to Google and do a search for things like MAMP, and that's ways to give you this all-encompassing way to install Apache with PHP and MySQL, so you've got everything that you need in one fell swoop on your environment. Of course, if you're on Windows, you'll do a search for WAMP. There's a handful of options for you if you're I'm not looking at the right thing here. WAMP server. I think this is it. So this is a Windows web development environment. It's going to give you everything that you need to develop PHP on your system: Apache, PHP, a MySQL database. I'm not going to walk you through how to install that, but I will link I'll link to other videos that might help walk you through that. Let's see, what was the other one? I think this is it, XAMPP. Yeah, so there's a handful of options if you're on Windows. There's a handful of options if you're on the Macintosh, of course. Linux is probably almost certainly already set up with everything that you need. But at a minimum, you're going to want to have PHP, a web server of some kind, likely Apache, and then, of course, something to actually compose your code, some kind of an editor. And I'll be using this one that you're looking at right now. So a couple things that I'll end up doing here. I just want to make sure that I've got PHP running. And what I'll do is, in my case, I'm not going to install any of those packages. I'm going to make use of the PHP editor that's built in. I think that's the correct syntax to just fire up an internal web server, and we'll know pretty quick if that's going to work for me. I'm going to go to my local host port 8000, which is what I configured the server to run on, and see if I got anything, and I do. So this output indicates all of the very specifics of the PHP configuration. It's actually probably more information than you need to know if this is the first time that you've actually messed with it. But what I'm doing here is I've created a single file called index.php, and I've included this method here called php info. And when I run that on a web server, it gives me this output. Now, the only reason I'm doing that is just because I want to make sure that everything is running the way that I'm expecting it to be running. And just by seeing this here on my screen, I can see that it is. So I'm pretty comfortable moving forward and actually starting some of these tutorials. Now, these tutorials are going to be very basic. If you've done any sort of programming before, you may not even want to watch this. This is the fundamentals here. This is the very basic stuff. And we'll probably cover it over the course of a couple of videos, maybe 2 or 3 even. And what we're going to be looking at is really the basics of how to set variables, the different variable types that you can set, different data structures that you can work with. We'll probably be covering control flow, like conditional logic and things of that nature. We won't yet get into creating database connections or doing things that are probably a lot more dynamic. So this entire series is going to be, I think, mostly brief, but it's going to cover the very basics. Let's go ahead and get started, and we'll talk about variables. So I'll probably stumble through a little bit of this stuff. You'll see me kind of, maybe out of my comfort zone here. I'm not a PHP developer, like I was saying. I'm in Java every day, and they're pretty different. They have some similarities as far as the syntax is concerned, but they're largely different languages. Java is considered a strongly typed language, so every time I'm setting a variable, I'm indicating what the type is. PHP doesn't do that. I'll give you an example of that right now. So the syntax to even set a variable. Let me show you. We'll create a variable and we'll call it test, and we'll give it a value of the string test. And in PHP, you terminate every line with a semicolon. White space doesn't mean anything in PHP, so you have to indicate to the PHP processor that your line is completed by including that semicolon. So this $sign indicates that you're setting a variable. A variable can be changed throughout the course of your script. Test represents the value. So we're using double quotes. That means that this test variable is a string. So what I'll do here is I'll output the value. Actually, before I output the value of the string, let me show you that right now, it's not going to do anything. You just see a blank screen. And the reason for that is because under the hood, back in the IDE, I'm setting a value or a variable of test to a string value of test, but I'm not outputting it, so it has nothing to do. It has no work to do. On this next line, I'm going to echo test. And what that should do is output it to the screen. And there it is. Okay? Simple enough. So the only reason I wanted to show this, I mean, it's pretty basic, obviously, is that I want to give you an idea of just some of the syntax that you need to be aware of as far as setting variables, because there are some rules that do apply. For example, you cannot set a variable like this. Okay? Because spaces are illegal. If you have an IDE, like I do, in this particular case, it's going to recognize that that's invalid. It's going to highlight it in some way and let you know that you can't do that. So spaces aren't going to work. Numbers, on the other hand, do. I can say test1, and that's okay. I can say test2. Here's some things that I don't know. I don't know if you can start it with a number. Let me try. And my IDE is telling me, in fact, I can't do that. So numbers are valid in a variable name, but starting them with a number is not. You also obviously can't start with a space. That's not going to work. You can start with symbols. You can start it with an underscore. You can probably include dashes. That is a negative on the dash. It looks like that's not allowed. So that's good to know. As far as the underscore goes, you could probably do 1, 2, or 3 at the start. I'm not sure that would be effective. They are case sensitive. So these are actually 2 different variables. Right? So I've got 2 strings, one set to capital T test, the other one just set to test. These are actually 2 different variables in PHP memory. So if I do this, I should get another test and not test because of the case sensitivity of PHP. I'll run back over, we'll give that a test, and sure enough it says another test here. If I were just to capitalize that T, that's a totally different variable as far as PHP is concerned. When I go back and look at it, I've got test. So there's a handful of things to understand about setting variables in PHP and a number of different rules that you need to be aware of. It's certainly wise, I think, to go and research some of that. You can Google it. You can probably find it on the PHP website. I'm setting strings here just to kind of give you an idea of how to set variables. Let's take a look though at some of the things to be aware of when setting string variables though as well. And this is something I just kind of reviewed before I started recording to make sure that I understood it. In Java, which I'm using most of the time, setting a string is actually, it's pretty straightforward. There's really only one way to do it, or there's a couple of ways to do it, but as far as doing it inline and using the quotes, you can really only get away with doing this in Java. So I'll say test string equals double quote, right? And my value is, this is a test, right? In Java, the only way to do it is to set these double quotes. In PHP, however, you can use single quotes. This will work. Shoot, let me output it. Test string. So that will work. Interestingly, this will also work. See, same thing. There are some differences though in setting the string variable with the double quote and the single quote. I'll see if I can get into those. It's still pretty fresh on my mind, but definitely very different for me, so hopefully I'll get it right. So let me show you a couple of other things. So I'm going to set another test, and I'm going to say this is another test, right? I will echo that to the screen, another test. This should be pretty straightforward. This is another test should appear on my screen when I look at this. And there it is. Now, one of the things that you can do in PHP is you can include the values of other strings within a string, like this, test string, right? Now, ideally, PHP should recognize by this $sign that test string here is an actual variable and replace it as part of the setting of another string, or as part of the setting of this variable, another test. It's not going to work here, however. It's going to be literal. And the reason for that is because there is a limitation in what you can get away with when you're using the single quotes when you're setting a string. So if I were to do this instead, this, I believe, should work. Like, you should actually see this is a test, right? And then a dash, and then this is another test output to the screen, I think. And you do. So that's kind of an interesting limitation of the double quote versus the single quotes. It almost kind of makes me think that using the double quotes is probably a good standard to follow. And that's certainly arguable. And if there's any PHP gurus out there, which I doubt, I mean, since this is kind of a fundamental video, if you know the answer to that question as far as standards and what's normal in the PHP community, I'd love to hear it. In my opinion, my instincts are kind of making me feel like trying to kind of set a pattern of using the double quotes exclusively for setting strings is a good idea. I could be wrong about that, but I'd certainly be interested in hearing everybody's thoughts. String concatenation is something that you can do in PHP. That means you could set a variable like this. This is part 1 of a string, and then before you terminate, this is actually a really terrible example. Let me do something else. Let me set a string like this. This is part 1. This is part 1. Okay. And we'll say this is part 2. Terminate that. Now I've got two variables here. I've got part 1 and I've got part 2. I'll echo both of those out to the screen. So we got part 1, right? Shoot. Part 2. And then I'll also echo a line break. You can echo HTML to the screen as well. In this particular case, I'm not actually doing any HTML processing, so I'm kind of limiting myself to having to do this. I'll show you how to get around that, or how to terminate your PHP scripting tags here so that you can break in and out of HTML if you need to. It's kind of a side note. It doesn't happen too much these days with some of the PHP frameworks, but something you should probably be aware of. So I've got this is part 1 and this is part 2. These are my two variables. And what I'm going to do here, let me get another one of these. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you string concatenation with two variables. So you can say echo, actually let's set a string. We'll say complete string equals part 1. We use the period for string concatenation and include a space and a dash, another period for string concatenation, and then we say part 2. So what we should see is output to the screen, this is part 1 dash, this is part 2, all on a single line. When we echo complete string to our screen, let's try it. And that's what we got. This is part 1, this is part 2. So that concept is called string concatenation, and it might look a little funny to you. It certainly looks funny to me. In Java and a handful of other languages that I use, including JavaScript, the string concatenation operator is the plus. In PHP, it is the period. And I think that's to just taunt me and make me feel stupid. That might be why they're doing it. So there's kind of a rundown on strings. Let me show you a couple of things about numbers, and specifically we'll talk about integers. Integers and floating points and how they work in PHP is somewhat fascinating to me because, like I said, I'm coming from a strongly typed language. There are differences in min and max ranges and differences in how numbers are stored in memory based on their type. So the fact that you don't declare a variable type in PHP is really kind of interesting to me. And I know that just based on the fact that it's got some functions for determining whether or not a number is an integer or a float, it suggests that it actually does, like, type does matter. It's just not something that gets declared explicitly by the programmer. It's probably something that is ultimately inferred by the PHP processor based on the number and how you're using it. So I'll show you a couple examples of that. So if we want to set a variable to an integer value, we'll do this. We'll set it to age, and we'll say 30. It's got to be if we're going to be working with an integer, it's got to be a whole number. So we're not going to set 30.5. We're going to set just 30. And then with integers, you can do things like basic math. I'll show you a couple examples of that. We'll say new age is age plus 1. So I've aged a year. I'll echo that, and I'll show you new age. And what we should see, if we know basic math, which is questionable, for me anyway, what we should see is 31 on the screen. And we do. So basic math obviously is a part of this. There are a handful of functions I'd like to show you. I don't know too many of the PHP functions. I'll show you how you can look some of those up. But I want to show you some of the basics as far as working with integers is concerned. So let's do this. Let's say total equals negative 420. But what we want to output to the screen is the absolute value of negative 420. Right? We'll use the function ABS. We'll include the variable total that we just included. Let me get rid of some of this other stuff, and we'll see that. If we've got a variable called total, which is negative 420, and we want to see the absolute value, we'd expect to see 420 as a positive integer on the screen, and we do. So that's the absolute value. We can say, instead of looking at absolute value, let's look at a number like 25. And what we want to output to the screen is the square root of number. And let's see what that does. That gives us the square root, which is 5. We've got random numbers as well that we can output to the screen. So let's take a look at that. So if I want to do a random range, for example, there's a function in PHP called rand, R-A-N-D. My IDE is giving me a hint on how to use it. You start it, its first argument is the minimum number, second argument is the maximum number. So I'll say that we want to do a random number between 2 and 10. So that's what's going to output to the screen. It could be any number between 2 and 10. I got 4. I'll try again. I got 10. Try again. I got 3. So that's working as we'd expect. Incrementing numbers, also something that you would do probably a lot of. Let's take a look at how to do that. So obviously, if we were to set a number like this, right? A number is 5. And we were to say number equals number plus 1. And then we echo that number. Obviously, you would expect to get 6. And you would be correct. So let me show you a couple of ways of shortcutting this process, because this can be very verbose to have to type this out. Number equals number plus 1. So instead what we'll do is we'll say number plus equals 1. And this is really just a shortcut method of doing the same thing that we just did. Let me show you. The result should still be 6. But even this can be shortened a bit. I'll show you. Because incrementing a variable by 1 is pretty common in most languages. So if you just include plus plus at the end, that's a really quick way of taking that variable and adding 1 to it in one fell swoop. And again, same deal, 6. If we were to set the initial value of this to 10 and have number plus plus get executed by the PHP processor, we output that again, we should expect to see 11. So kind of a simple way of doing that. It's kind of the basics of numbers, of integers rather. Let's take a look at floating points. Again, unlike some of the strongly typed languages like C#, Java, etc., you don't have to declare your type. It's just going to be inferred based on what you're actually setting your variable to. So while you might be inclined to do something like float variable equals 5.2, you don't do that in PHP. You just set it like you'd set any other variable. So the same way that we were setting integers, we set floating points the same way. We just actually use a floating point number. So this is no longer exclusively a whole number. You can have decimals here as well. So in this case, we've got a floating point of 5.2. And then, like integers, we've got a handful of functions that we can use to manipulate or modify these variables. First, let me show you how basic math works with floating points. So let me do this. We'll take an integer. We'll call it base, and we'll set that to 1.5. Okay. Let me use the correct syntax. And then what we'll do is we'll say, here's an integer. Call it int base, and we'll set that to 7. So we've got two variables here. One of them obviously is a floating point. The other one is an integer. But what we'll do is we'll set total equal to base plus int base. Our answer is pretty straightforward here. It's going to be 8.5. But what that's done is it's the PHP processor, when faced with an expression like this, is going to say, okay, well, we've got a floating point number here, but we've also got an integer. So what's my type going to be for total? Well, in order to do the math correctly, it has no choice but to make it a floating point. So in this case, total is a floating point. When we echo that to the screen, what we should see is 8.5. 8.5 is a floating point number. So just something to be aware of. It's because typing isn't something that you have to specifically express. It's not a huge deal, but it's just something to kind of keep in the back of your head. For another example of that, by the way, is if we were to take two integer numbers, like int 1, which is 10, and int 2, which is 3, and we were to say answer equals int 1 divided by int 2, when we echo that to the screen, our answer, despite the fact that we're working with two integers, our answer should be a floating point because it's not a whole number. So again, pretty basic stuff, not something that you really need to be overly concerned about because PHP does kind of take care of that for you. Let's take a look at some of the functions that are used to modify or manipulate floating point numbers. If you have, let's say, a number of 5.72, right? That's our floating point. One of the things that you can do is you can round that number. You can round number, right? Now, I think there's a number of ways to do this. I think you can actually set your decimal places as well. Let me try this. Shoot. This is where the IDE would really kind of help me out. It's not helping me out. I think you can do this. Let me try. So we've got 5.72. If I round, I think that if I round, it's going to round it up to the nearest whole number. I'm not sure, and it does. So 5.72 rounded up to the nearest whole number is obviously 6, right? Now, if we say, I think that we have a second argument in round to choose the decimal that you want to round it to, and I want to round it to a single decimal. So that's 5.7. Okay, good. So in that case, it rounds down to the single decimal of 5.7. But when I exclude that, PHP assumes that I want the nearest whole number. In that particular case, it's going to be 6. So in this case, it's rounding up to an integer. In this case, it has no choice but to round down to a floating point. So there's two others, and these are actually functions that I started using years and years ago in another language that's no longer even relevant anymore. But there's a stealing function and a floor function, and I think PHP calls them something different other than stealing and floor. I think it calls it floor. I don't think it calls it stealing. Let me set a number to 10.23, and we will try to find the ceiling. There it is. It's seal. Okay, so this is kind of like rounding. The difference, though, is that it's going to round up to the nearest whole number, or it's going to round, I'm sorry, it's not going to round to the nearest. It's going to round either up to the nearest whole number, or it's going to go down to the nearest whole number. So that means basically if you've got 10.23 and you want ceiling, that means any fraction, no matter how minor it is, you have any fraction after that whole number, it should round it up to the first whole number above this, which is 11. So let's see if I'm right about that, and I am. So on the flip side, if I were to have 10.999999, I'm right there, right at 11. But I say I want the floor. Give me the floor. It's going to say, hey, regardless of the fact that you've got this fraction after the whole number, bring it all the way down to just the whole number itself, which is 10. So it should ignore all of this and just give me the 10. And that is exactly what it does. So that's kind of the basics of numbers, setting numbers and variables in PHP. There's a handful of other things to take a look at. What I'll do next is I'll show you how to interact your PHP with HTML, which is obviously pretty key. There's a lot of things to be aware of about that with a lot of the modern frameworks these days. Separations of concerns and MVC design patterns. You no longer really find yourself wanting to do too much mingling of PHP in your HTML, but that's definitely a longer conversation, which we'll cover. We'll also cover some more in-depth data structures like arrays, some flow control, like if this condition exists, do this, otherwise do something else, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the basics. Go with that for now. We'll take it from there and we'll see what else we can cover in the next video.